My paper falls into two parts. The first is an account of the American Students for a Democratic Society, which was formed in 1962. I'm not doing that particularly out of historical interest, but it perhaps offers some kind of template for what might be a more ambitious student movement in this country. The second part is more focused on specific issues for British students, and it's more, obviously, more micro focus. In fact, the paper moves between the micro and the macro quite a bit, so I hope you'll bear with me in that respect. It's a less theoretical paper than the ones we've had, and maybe I can put that right if that's an issue in the Q&A session. My generation, probably a little bit older than I look, bears a certain disappointment that things have developed socially, politically the way they have. Probably the strongest opposition to, and the most coherent opposition to neoliberalism was the new left of the 1960s and 70s, which Labour was much closer to in those days than it is to the extra parliamentary left now. The key theme of the new left, particularly in the States, which I'm familiar with, was democracy. And I just float the idea that in terms of the two values of equality and democracy, it may be procedurally sensible to go for democracy first. It's once you have democracy, you have a lever to try and achieve greater equality. George Orwell, after the Second World War, welcomed nationalisation, but he also suggested the abolition of the monarchy, the House of Lords and the public schools. This country is extremely hierarchical, and pushing the notion and the reality of participatory democracy might be more than helpful in that respect. To go then to the example that I mentioned of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS had a macro vision of society, but it rode on the back of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. It also was a response to quite micro issues in the universities. For instance, students of places like Berkeley and elsewhere weren't allowed to visit the other sex, the opposite sex, however you conceive of it, except at specific hours. Also, halls of residence were sex segregated. So there's been some progress since then. But those issues helped to spark, as well as civil rights in the South, where many students got involved, helped to push things on in the early 60s. The Students for a Democratic Society was formed in 1962 and tapped into the rising progressive mood of the time. This is an extract from the founding document, the Port Huron Statement. We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably at the world we inherit. As we grew, our comfort was penetrated by events too troubling to dismiss: racial bigotry and the Cold War, and increasingly also urban poverty, in fact rural poverty too, came to the fore. So SDS, some way into the student movement, had quite a broad vision. Today, more than 50 years later, many young people again appear to be looking uncomfortably at the world they have inherited. The main issues now are different and in some ways of more immediate interest to young people. Escalating inequality of wealth, which definitely has a generational aspect, the stunting of generational opportunity, and the huge and unfair cost of studying for a degree. These are substantial issues capable of sustaining a broader movement if the connections can be made. SDS was organised, and organisation is important, into chapters, and within 3 years 50 chapters were established throughout the country's campuses. As I've indicated, SDS's philosophy was highly participatory, but it did have a president and a national coordinating committee. It got funding from various liberal and left organisations, and again in the spirit of concern for inequality, it set up about 12 projects up and down the country, economic research and action projects in deprived areas, and some of them had a practical effect, but again it sustained this philosophy of participation, and that was the way the projects were run. It's a tough agenda, but and it was actually quite often postgraduate students that worked for a year or so. Of course, without longer term funding, these projects were not likely to last too long. A few of them lasted a few years. Could a national organisation similar to SDS be set up in Britain today? Optimistically, my answer to the question would be possibly it could. Obviously, there would be have to be a well-publicised inaugural meeting and the necessary organisational framework. A founding statement of principle and focus, such as the Port Huron Statement, might be produced. That would be a beginning. What would a British student for a democratic society do? Firstly, it's likely it would organise to get student fees either greatly reduced or abolished. Largely due to student action, fees have been, I understand, abolished in Germany, so it can be done. More widely, a British SDS could link up with, and no doubt would overlap in personnel with, groups and networks such as Occupy and 38 Degrees. 38 Degrees is, do people aware of 38 Degrees? Yeah. It's very good on single issues. I think perhaps the problem with the new means of communication is that they are limited in that respect. It's difficult to see without physically coming together how a wider movement could be generated. But Occupy has not been very successful in that respect. And there are other instances where things have looked good on social media but have not materialised. Despite its successes, there are problems about the way the American SDS evolved. In the mid to late 60s, it splintered into various strands, one favouring a coalitionist approach with the Democratic Party, which actually had some success in terms of supporting Eugene McCarthy and later McGovern. It also splintered into an urban guerrilla group, the Weather People, initially called the Weathermen, but somebody pointed out rightly that was sexist, but the Weather People, who I think mistakenly got involved in urban violence, as did the Baader-Meinhof group. I mean, I do regard this as a I know in terms of anything that's happening in Britain, this is reaching way ahead, but it was a mistake. There was the hippie flower power strand, which was fun, and to the horror of some and the bliss of others, the Jesus movement. So it became very fragmented. Perhaps the practical lesson, though, is that SDS should have avoided ideological factionism and remained a holding and enabling organisation for a variety of radical and progressive groups and views and initiatives. As best as I can judge, there is considerable dissent among young people in Britain today, though perhaps an even wider feeling of powerlessness and perhaps apathy. But there is also this possibly this feeling of discontent which could generate energy. But feeling won't get you or us very far. In the advice of the American trade unionist Joe Hill, organise. That may seem obvious, but I stress the point because unless some group makes a move to organise, not much will happen. As I said, I come with a certain sense of failure because my generation, in the Great Divide, my generation on the left lost. And it's not a pleasant feeling. But activists today who did take an initiative would not find themselves alone. Considerable opposition exists to the centralisation of power and wealth in this country, including particularly within the education system, obviously within the economy. No doubt some people here actively support one or other of the many existing activist groups, at least to the extent of signing up for some of their issues. Just to make a larger point, the micro is important, I'll come to that shortly. But in a year's time there is an election, and there might well be some mileage in trying to push the Labour Party to take on board the abolition of fees, or at least the drastic reduction. There's only a year, so forming a new party is a bit ambitious within that scale of time, although the right of centre in the form of UKIP has taken that step, and I think that some of its support probably could have been, despite their reactionary terrible policies, could have been for the left. Maybe who dares wins, and Farage, for all that he's at times, I mean, he's a bright man, but he seemed a comic figure at times, but he took the risk, and he's accruing the benefits. In the longer term, I think if the next government fails to respond to some of these issues, then the formation of a new party, UKIP as an example, the Labour Party had to be formed at one time. Maybe that's a route, but I'm now looking at things in a very broad context. So just to say a few things about the universities themselves. The difficulty is that the recent increase in hierarchy, typical of British institutional life, has been implemented with a vengeance within the higher education system, real treason of clerks. The trend has been towards an unequal restructuring of pay and rewards, as well as an upwards redistribution of power. Management now calls the shots. This is not new. I'll go and quote the an SDS document from 1963. Students in the great centres of higher learning have learned, though still in inchoate ways, that higher education divorced from high purpose reflects a society in which initiative is seen as an administrative problem. And as the universities begin to approach the model of other institutions, that sort of resonates with the takeover of the neoliberal model. The model of other institutions, the problem of university reform takes on many of the same burdens as more general social reform. It has become very difficult for academics to mitigate these tendencies. Some things have been. How am I
5 more minutes.
Huh?
5 more minutes.
Oh, 5 more minutes. Okay. Let me suggest things that could be done. Where members of social science or other subject departments share similar values, progressive organisational options are possible. These include rotation of departmental roles, including representation on faculty committees, can be done. Collective statements such as letters to the press or joint articles on issues of social justice are an option, and I and other colleagues have done this from time to time. There's no reason why postgrads or undergrads shouldn't do that. It is necessary to break out of this sort of cage of oppression. Efforts can be made to persuade the unions to negotiate more democratic structures of power within higher education. A few years ago, they actually negotiated more hierarchical structures of power, the unions, rather than flatter, more democratic ones. I got a letter this morning from an organisation called Activism in Sociology Forum. Anybody heard of Activism in Sociology Forum? Okay, it was formed at the last BSA conference. Just to pursue this point about doing something, these are some things they suggested. Setting up, some of them are already happened. Setting up a website with a facility for anonymous or pseudonym blogging by members, and a directory listing members and their expertise who are prepared to speak to media, community and campaign groups. Creating an alternative university. This could mean lots of different things, but might involve relatively modest interventions such as setting up a seminar in a bank or in a university to protest at for instance, the marketisation of education and to engage the public. Setting up a Facebook group as a way to reach out to new people. These things are currently being done. If you're a sociologist, well, I'll leave this letter which came to me this morning, and I've been somewhat involved in this group. So if you're a psychologist or a politician, this may stimulate to do something similar. Other ideas would be producing pamphlets, lobbying politicians, collaborating with community groups, some of which I've indicated before. There's also a society called publicuniversity.org.uk, which is arguing for a public model of the university, a model that rather than simply serve, that the universities simply serve the government, but that they retain a critical view of society. And if there is a need to take sides, Howard Becker suggests it boils down in the end to which side are you on. Then I suggest it's the groups that we've have been indicated today, minorities, and also the many losers, the majority of losers in the present neoliberal dominated system. Thank you.